The next question, and perhaps a more challenging one, is to ask how do religious and spiritual views of the environment affect people's environmental actions? Yes, we've seen many examples of how religious views affect how people view the environment, but does it actually affect at all how people act towards the environment? That is, I think, a complex question, and one that will vary a lot by which specific culture we're talking about, which specific context, and a variety of historical and political factors. But different people have different views on this topic. So you read an interview with Leslie Sponsel. Leslie Sponsel is a well-known environmental anthropologist who's written a lot about spiritual ecology. And Les Sponsel he makes no bones about his central contention, which is that he feels, based on his own research and studies, that religion and spirituality can play a significant role in conservation, and more so even that they must play a significant role. He suggests that several decades of technological and secular attempts at conservation have been helpful, but not fully sufficient. We continue to sort of be careening towards significant environmental issues. And he sees sort of grassroots religious movements that favor conservation as potentially something that could have a profound effect in helping to move the needle beyond what we've already been able to do solely with sort of technological changes and legal changes and political changes. That there needs to be sort of the types of thinking changes that could come about if people were to adopt more environmentally friendly iterations of their own religious philosophies. Sort of his underlying assumption there being that religion informs many people's worldviews in profound ways. To his credit, Les Sponsel in his book Spiritual Ecology, A Quiet Revolution also talks to some degree about a variety of not religious kind of worldviews, including atheism, in relation to this concept of a sacred ecology, which I think that is a very positive thing that he includes that as well. But his point of view is that, again, that if religions and faith groups and spiritual groups are to get involved, as some have already, that this could seriously help the conservation crisis that we face. So what do we think about that? Different people have different ideas about it. I'm curious to hear yours in the discussion that's due this week, because it's an interesting question, right? I think it's a really important question, actually. Do religious views actually impact how people treat their environment? Because there's environmental attitudes, how people think about the environment, but that is not necessarily the same thing as environmental behaviors. It was the case when I lived in North Texas. I had the good pleasure to be involved in research on people's decisions to use mass transit. And one of the things that we discovered with students that we surveyed was that how people viewed the environment, how people viewed climate change, how seriously they took these issues. While it was important for them, of course, that it had much less of an effect on their actual decision to use the bus than you would think. Instead, things like convenience, schedules, a need to get to work, there's a whole lot of factors that influenced people's decisions to ride the bus or not ride the bus, other than their sort of worldview about climate change or their worldview about the environment. So environmental attitudes and environmental behaviors aren't necessarily the same thing. On the other hand, can we think of examples where they do influence each other, where environmental attitudes do profoundly affect environmental behaviors? We're going to talk about several. Okay, but before I get into that, before I start making the case that yes, religious and spiritual views can profoundly affect people's environmental actions, I want to emphasize that it does so often in a patchy way. What I mean by a patchy way, in a way that is patchy, is that here and there you see these effects, but you don't always see these effects on cultures, that their environmental beliefs necessarily affect their behaviors, or that believing that nature is sacred necessarily translates into conservation. It's never a straightforward thing how a society will use its environmental resources, its environmental surroundings. I put here China versus India versus the USSR, the former USSR. The reason I bring up these three, well, allow me to explain. So I often, when I teach another class, Anthropology of Religion, I sometimes ask my students to rank religions by how environmentally friendly they think they are. Inevitably, Christianity goes somewhere towards the least environmentally friendly end of the spectrum for most of my students, and inevitably, towards the upper end are religions from East Asia and South Asia, such as Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism. So China and India both offer interesting cases in point. India, of course, Hinduism is the dominant religion, with Buddhism, Jainism, and other South Asian religions also having really strong presences there. Islam, of course. In India, as we've already discussed, there are definitely very strong environmental or views about sacred ecology, goddesses of the ocean in parts of southern India, views of the cows as sacred, views of more generally just that situates within broader views of reincarnation and the interconnectedness of life, concepts of ahimsa. And sometimes we see that manifest in people's profound environmental decision making. So a good example is within Jainism, monks and nuns actively choosing to sweep the ground before them so that they don't accidentally step on insects or other small organisms, and straining the water and filtering the air so that they won't accidentally consume microorganisms, and living a purely vegan lifestyle, which of course, for a lot of different reasons, going vegetarian or vegan, and all things being equal, because this can depend a lot on where you're getting your vegetables versus where you're getting your meat, but all things being equal, that's if you're using agriculture to provide your calories, that can be a way to significantly reduce your footprint on the planet is vegetarianism or veganism. So with Jain monks and nuns, then we see a really profound example of religion and these concepts of ahimsa and reincarnation and non-harm and beings as reincarnated beings and the concepts of sin, all of these profoundly affecting people in what we might regard as pro-environment ways. And we can think of lots of other examples. My colleague Pankaj Jain in University of North Texas has written excellent work on Jain Dharma as well as Hindu groups and their conservation actions and how those relate to their religious beliefs. On the other hand, India is not without its environmental problems, as you would think of any industrial and industrializing nation of roughly 1 billion people, right? And as I mentioned before, the Ganges has a number of environmental problems despite being a sacred river, not the least of which is concerns with hydroelectric dam development and how that affects the river, as well as the presence of populations near the river, as well as pollution. There are issues, right? India, despite these positive environmental things we could say about the effects of things like Jainism and Hinduism, it's not as if India is some perfect environmental utopia where every problem has been solved. Definitely not. China would be another example. Historically, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism were all three very dominant religious traditions within China, as well as sort of more various iterations of folk shamanism and ancestor veneration that intertwined with those big three world religions in interesting ways. So that's China. And so given how both Taoism and Buddhism tend to speak about the connectedness of human beings and their surroundings, especially Taoism, one would expect a place like China to be very environmentally forward-thinking. Historically, in some ways, that's certainly the case, that there were Chinese villages and communities where people went to great lengths to properly farm the landscape and do so in a sustainable manner. But there were also certainly, over the past 1500 years, plenty of examples, too, of communities within China where grasslands or other areas got environmentally overused. And certainly since the advent of the PRC, of the People's Republic of China government, which it was particularly at the start rather militantly anti-religious and anti-traditional religion in China, and actively quashing religion, as indeed one could argue is still occurring in regards to Uyghurs, Muslims. In that space of sort of aggressive anti-religion fervor, the PRC has proliferated for several decades and continues to have a number of different environmental challenges, not the least of which is air pollution in some of the cities, as well as, like any large industrialized nation, some environmental success stories as well. My point with both China and India is to suggest that it's not as simple as religion then. Both are large nations with religious traditions that would suggest strongly pro-environmental decisions, one of which has continued to adhere to those traditions, India, one of which has sort of in some ways squashed them, and then later had something of a resurgence of them in the case of China. And, it would also be a mistake to attribute China's current environmental problems solely to the, again, sort of anti-religious fervor of PRC leaders, especially during the Cultural Revolution. That would be simplistic as well. Although instead, we should look at both the environmental successes as well as challenges of both China and India as reflecting not just religious views, but also things like extremely large population sizes of about 1 billion people, resource colonialism in the case of occupation of areas like Tibet, the demands of an industrial economy, even in situations where you have a nation understanding itself to be communist, such as PRC traditionally, it's still working on sort of a basic industrial sort of economy, right? And that has environmental impacts as well, with China in particular, and to some degree India as well, as a nation is rapidly transitioning towards different kinds of energy production, moving through the stages of heavy coal reliance. And so there's a lot of things going on here other than solely religion. And we could say the same for the USSR, of course. So the USSR, traditionally Russian areas and Eastern European areas, heavily Christianized, as well with Russian Orthodoxy, as well as various forms of shamanism and local folk religion, as well as animistic religion. USSR, I bring them up as an example because sometimes people want to say, well, maybe, of course, religion isn't everything, but worldview is, and sort of the capitalist worldview, right, is what causes all environmental problems. We can define capitalism and socialism in different ways, but if we take capitalism to mean a specific sort of laissez-faire approach to market economies, then the USSR would not be that. Others would say that it is, that it's just state-controlled capitalism. But in any case, my point with the USSR is that the USSR, despite not being, let's say at the very least, not the same kind of capitalist that the US is, was definitely not without its environmental problems during its several decades of existing as a political entity. A number of different pollution hotspots and serious pollution issues within the USSR, some of which became very evident to the rest of the world once the Iron Curtain fell. And so it's not as simple as this religion versus that religion. It's not as simple as this political ideology versus that political ideology. Environmental decisions are very often complex creatures resulting from many different things. Okay, so now that I've kind of done my due anthropological diligence and talked all about nuance and all that, let's talk about some basic ideas, concepts, and arguments within the discussion of whether or not religion affects people's environmental actions. So a concept, one of the first people to really get us thinking a lot about this was back in the 60s with Lynn White. He wrote a really influential paper, influential not just for anthropologists, but for historians and sociologists, and especially for philosophers and theologians, and not just academics, but also people in the ministry, people in theological fields, people in seminaries. He wrote a paper called The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It's always bothered me that it's not ecological crisis, but you can take that up with Lynn White. Lynn White was, if memory serves, Anglican, but I could be mistaken on that. He was mainline Protestant, though, which made his argument all the more interesting. He argued that there was significant environmental problems in the quote-unquote West, i.e. in Europe, the United States, etc., and that the culprit was largely Judeo-Christianity, and more specifically, the Genesis narrative. So here I've got Adam and God, although that's not really a scene from Genesis, that's just sort of an artistic representation. But anyways, specifically Genesis 1:26, I believe, where it talks about humanity having, the way it gets translated in King James is dominion over the earth. There's other ways to translate that don't sound as domineering, but the way it has been translated in some of the most common English translations has been dominion. And so Lynn White argues that concept, the concept of humans as dominating nature, that then has had this reverberation of extremely aggressive views towards nature as a commodity, as something to be cut down if needs be, that have pervaded Christianity and therefore affected and Judaism, and therefore affected Europe and made for a very environmentally destructive sort of cultural tradition. He also brings up the idea of sort of Christians cutting down sacred forests of pre-Christian or non-Christian pagans in Europe. So Lynn White's argument definitely touched off a huge amount of debate, specifically about Judeo-Christianity and Abrahamic religions in relation to environmentalism and whether or not, and people coming out on both sides, whether or not this was a valid argument. And it also ignited a very big debate just more generally of sort of eco-theology and the question of to what degree religions in general, not just Judeo-Christian religions or Abrahamic religions, to what degree religions in general influence people's environmental behaviors, and can we look at a religion that's the majority of a civilization and therefore predict how they'll act environmentally? And some people would say very, very much yes. That was part of some of the motivation for certain kinds of countercultural spiritual movements in the 1960s in the US, and other people feel like this doesn't really hold as much water. Lynn White's specific argument, by the way, is kind of interesting. It's one that seems to intrinsically make sense to people, and I think that's one of the reasons why people put Christianity where they do when I have them rank the environmental friendliness of religion, is people will sometimes bring up that very concept of dominion over the environment. It's worth pointing out that there are other kinds of Christian traditions about the environment. St. Francis of Assisi comes to mind, the patron saint of ecology, who spoke to animals and reveled in the glory of creation and preached to birds, whose name, by the way, was the inspiration for the current Pope, Pope Francis, who recently released Laudato Si, and other kinds of strong proclamation on environmental issues and environmental justice, and sort of arguing for a Christian moral imperative of caring for the planet as a moral issue, including climate change in particular. We could bring up other examples as well. Where I do research in Western New York, you have a very well cared for, small but significantly enough sized forest that has been preserved very intact because it is regarded to be the site of an important visionary experience for the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, Joseph Smith. And so in my research, I look a lot at the different efforts people have made to preserve that space, even people that, some people, not all people by any stretch, but some people within the movement who might identify as rather politically conservative, and yet have put a lot of effort into maintaining this specific space because of its visionary associations, and more generally will, when talking about this, cite the fact that nature is, quote, like a temple, that nature is this place that you go and experience God very vividly. So I don't think it's quite as simple as Lynn White's making it out to be, and I think if we were to look at the environmental tragedies that have sometimes happened in Europe and the US, we'd have to point out a lot of other things, not the least of which is capitalism, market economies, industrialism, the influences of Western philosophy, Hellenic philosophy, a lot of things other than just the ones he's bringing up. So it's complex, but when you look at Lynn White's thesis, there's some underlying assumptions there that religion does have a potent effect on people's environmental behavior, that people generally interpret one religion the same, right? He's kind of rooting it all in this one Bible verse and assuming people generally interpret it the same. And that's not necessarily the case. People look at Genesis 1:26 and come to pretty different interpretations, and you have the example of a variety of Christian environmental movements nowadays who obviously don't think of it as dominion in the sense that he's saying it. So we've got plenty of counterexamples. Either way, I think the discussion, though, is still a rich and helpful discussion because it gets us thinking about, what effects does religion have on environmental behavior. The research that I've had you read about and that I've mentioned a couple of times with the San Francisco peaks, I'm not going to belabor this since I've talked about this a number of times in this course, but is another really good example, right? People's belief about this mountain as a sacred being, about Hojon, about this universal, or this important harmony with balance with, proper relationship with is maybe a better term, proper relationship with holy beings, with your surroundings, with each other, that those kind of beliefs have influenced people profoundly enough to do things such as protest over at this point 2 decades, even when a lot of other people with other kinds of motivations have sometimes been involved for decades, right? There are people who don't have that same spiritual kind of motivation but have been there for decades protesting, but there are others who've sort of been in and out to lesser degrees, but folks that have that sort of traditional connection going back to time immemorial have sometimes been the ones that have stuck around a really long time and been willing to take certain kinds of really vocal stances, which one expects when one is talking about a being, right? A being regarded as a grandmother, as a holy being standing there. So does it matter if we decide mountains are living beings? Well, in this case, it certainly matters enough to motivate a very long-standing activist movement. So yeah, it has significant effects on people's environmental behaviors to the point where they're willing to very much stand against the expansion of a ski resort that other people have more mixed feelings about. So there's a number of people in that local town Flagstaff who see it as not environmentally the best, but not environmentally the worst. But if you view the mountain as a sacred being, that certainly changes how you might interpret it. And again, I don't want to simplify. There's a lot of people who don't have those sorts of religious views on the mountain and still have been involved for decades in resisting snowmaking on other sorts of grounds. But I just want to suggest that traditional Navajo, Dene spirituality, traditional Hopi spirituality, traditional Apache spirituality, and other indigenous nations has been a huge motivating force for a very long-standing activist movement, which has persisted even despite both a few victories, and some significant defeats in a variety of contexts. Another example of religion, so those are two, that's an example with the San Francisco peaks of religion really profoundly affecting people's environmental behaviors. I want to share another one now, which is kind of a subset of a bigger topic, which is how religion affects the animals people eat, or whether they eat animals at all. So I'll specifically talk about Mary Douglas here. Mary Douglas is one of my favorite anthropologists. She's one of those anthropologists who, despite being from decades ago, her theory actually still holds a lot of water and is really good theory. She's famous for the theory of matter out of place, that societies, to oversimplify, that societies develop categories by which they understand the world, and that they consider to be polluting those things which defy those categories, which blur the categories, which mix and match the categories. One of the most famous articles she wrote in this regard was The Abominations of Leviticus, where she takes a crack at a topic that has attracted many scholars and theologians' attention over the years, which is why animals such as pigs, certain kinds of aquatic animals, are not kosher. That in the book of Leviticus there in the Torah, and later the Bible, are regarded as not clean for human consumption, and thus leading to kosher law. So she talks about it, she says, there's a lot of different interpretations. Her take on it is it all goes back to holiness. The book of Leviticus is all about holiness, and holiness being exemplified by completeness. As she says, holiness requires that individuals conform to the class to which they belong, which means keeping distinct the categories of creation. What does she mean by categories of creation? Well, part of what she talks about, a couple of things. One is that in the Genesis creation story, you have air creatures, water, or air creation, the creation of the air, creation of the water, creation of the land, the separation of the three, and of specific creatures from each that are talked about, right? The fish of the sea, the fowls of the air, and the creeping things on the earth. And so that some entities like certain kinds of insects, right, that are both airborne but also sort of land creatures were regarded as unclean, right? They're mixing categories of creation. So we see here kind of a social construction of the environment, a certain understanding of the environment that's playing out in people's dietary behaviors and what they eat and what they don't eat, and people choosing to not eat certain forms of protein that were readily available. Same with pigs, but kind of different. The idea that there are ruminant animals that chew the cud and have hooves, and then there are animals that don't chew the cud, and Leviticus notes as a problem animals that don't chew the cud but split the hoof, that have hooves, or vice versa, animals that are ruminants but don't have hooves. So for the example of the latter, of an animal that chews its cud but does not have hooves, we would think they would talk about like rock hares, which may or may not be a certain kind of rabbit, which rabbits kind of look like they're chewing cud, even though that's not actually what they're doing. but they don't have hooves, obviously. So they don't fit the categories, right? You're supposed to be like a sheep or a cow, right? You're supposed to have hooves, but also be a ruminant. Another example is pigs, which are of course not kosher, and specifically Douglas's point on that is, they have hooves, but they don't chew the cud. So again, this idea of categories of creation not being kept distinct, and then those things are considered abominable. So a way in which religion plays out into people's eating choices. Interestingly, Douglas later developed different kinds of ideas about what might explain the Leviticus taboos, but we don't really have space for that right now. Partly because I want us to talk about that great reading by Sue Darlington. Susan Darlington's a great scholar. I've had the pleasure to meet Susan Darlington a couple of times, and she's also just a really kind person. But Professor Darlington's great article, The Good Buddha and the Fierce Spirits, she's written a number of times about Buddhist environmental monks in Thailand. Of course, Buddhism is predominant religion in Thailand. And Thailand is part of Southeast Asia, which has experienced a major environmental crisis over the late 20th century, which this map shows, right? Incredible biodiversity hotspots of these tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia that have rapidly declined in the face of population increases, agriculture, as well as logging, among other things. And since the 1970s in Thailand, there's been a movement of Phra Nak Anurak, or environmental monks, as they are popularly known in English, who see this as a problem, who see deforestation as a problem. And a lot of local people see forests as inhabited by spirits, and so that's kind of naturally where our brains go. If you hear, Buddhist environmental movement, you think, oh, well, maybe because of like Buddhist views of spirits and of reincarnation, and because these trees could have been reincarnated from humans or something like that, right? That's kind of where your brain might naturally go. That would be wrong. Instead, what Buddhist monks are tending to emphasize is that that environmental problem, destruction of forest, is a problem, because it's an outgrowth of greed and of ignorance, of the very kinds of things that as monks you're sort of obligated to be speaking out against, those sort of root human behaviors that in Buddhism are viewed as extremely destructive to people's spiritual paths. And furthermore, deforestation is an environmental problem, in their view, as Darlington explains, because it's suffering, right? Deforestation causes landslides, deforestation causes food insecurity, deforestation causes issues for small rural communities that live near those forests. You have a big logging company come in and then screw up the quality of life for a rural community, thus contributing to suffering. And of course, if you know anything about Buddhism, you know that dukkha, or suffering, is kind of core to Buddhism, right? The idea of extinguishing suffering, this suffering can be overcome, is intrinsic to the Four Noble Truths. And so here we have a deeply Buddhist sort of way of thinking about deforestation, and it's not sort of in the way you might initially think when you first hear about it as reincarnation beliefs, but instead about kind of a broader moral pattern of suffering and greed and ignorance and attachment as problems that must be combated because of their effects on human beings, the dukkha, or suffering of human beings. These environmental monks have done a number of different environmental actions, though. It's not just been sort of teaching this, but actually things like sustainable agriculture projects, things like establishing wildlife sanctuaries, and things like ordaining trees. Now we put ordination in quotes here because it's not actually very much in line with Buddhist rules for monastic living, which are very specific to ordain a tree. And indeed, when the monks do this, they are not actually quoting from the monastic codes. That's not an ordination in the sense that you would ordain a human being. Instead, it's a more symbolic act. But starting in the 70s, you had monks doing things like tying saffron robes around trees and sort of ordaining them and then putting an image of the Buddha there. And the conceptualization there was not that the trees themselves are monks, but that people have a regard for monks and that you're not supposed to harm monks, and that therefore there's sort of a protection and a respect that, we should also have that kind of a respect for trees. It brings up the idea that, deforestation, cutting trees, is a spiritual issue and not just an economic issue. And then also, as Prakupitak Nantakun brings up, it also touches on several different strains of spiritual thought for local people. As he says, the good Buddha and the fierce spirits help each other take care of the forest. That's a common quote. This means that the Buddha, the images that they put in the forest, earns the villagers' respect, but they fear the spirits, i.e. the forest spirits. If you have both respect and fear, the villagers won't dare cut the trees. So using people's religious views as a way of promoting conservation. Has that been successful? It's hard to say. So, because that depends on what we consider to be the cause of the decline of deforestation. So, Thailand, starting in 1975, really took a stance of getting back to better forest cover and eventually trying to get it back to 40% forest cover, which they've not hit yet. They're at about 30%. And that's partly been an effort of trying to turn back the clock by actually reforesting or afforesting, doing things like planting commercial tree plantations to try to, or just doing tree plantings, period, to try to get forest cover back increased again from its kind of low point, as you can see in 1990. Overall, deforestation over time is, from the data I've looked at, has decreased, sort of. The deforestation is still happening, but the rate of change, the rate of forest loss has markedly decreased. In fact, it's been cut in half since 1990. It's now down to over, in like the early 2000s, it was like 0.4% per year, which is a lot less than 0.72% per year. That might not seem like a huge difference, but that is a very huge difference. And indeed, some regions of Thailand have actually seen forest cover increase, while others have still seen it decrease. So this is sort of a success. At least there's sort of a slight slowing down of the environmental catastrophe. To what degree can we attribute that to the work of Thai Buddhist environmental monks? It's difficult to say. There's a lot of other factors going on in Thailand, such as the government's very intentional efforts starting in the 1970s to work towards reforestation as a goal. But it would be difficult to say that the environmental monks, given the very high regard for Buddhism within Thailand, it would be hard to say that they didn't have any effect at all. And I think it's, although correlation is definitely not always causation, I think it's notable at the very least that the environmental monks themselves have done a number of environmental projects as a result of their beliefs, and that they've been able to convince villagers many times to be less active in cutting down their tree cover as a result, apparently. It's have these effects of getting people to not cut down the trees, which may not have huge effects across the country, but at least at specific village levels probably has had pretty significant impacts for specific forests and specific villages. And indeed, that's a pattern we see in a lot of religion and ecology studies, that some of the biggest effects that are had are when a land is consecrated or regarded as sacred, right? We have a number of different examples in Southeast Asia, not just in Thailand, but of Buddhist stupas, Buddhist temples, where you then have areas of forest around that are regarded as not to be cut down by local villagers. You don't go there for firewood, you don't go there to set up a horticultural plot, and as a result you have sort of de facto nature preserves, de facto centers of biodiversity long before we had, nature preserves in the modern sense. And that's the case in many different places around the world, that sacred places, whether or not people were thinking of it as we're doing this to conserve the land, have oftentimes been sort of de facto nature reserves. Certainly that's the case in my own research, again, with that forest in upstate New York. Another example of spiritual ecology affecting people's environmental actions we can see from looking at the people on whose lands most of us dwell, Dena'ina lands. I live in Yaganan in the Kenai Peninsula, the good land, next to Tikatnu or Cook Inlet. I live on Dena'ina land. And Dena'ina people traditionally, prior to the arrival of Christianity, beliefs, and to some degree since, people have held on to those traditions and concepts in different varying ways, often in tandem with Christianity, in sort of subtle ways, still having traces of these spiritual beliefs, and some people more actively. But in any case, traditionally, prior to Christianity, the idea was very much that the social world and the ecological world were intimately interconnected. Certainly that historically there was a time when animals talked, as Peter Kalfornsky says, that there was, he's a writer of this excellent collection of stories. Anyways, the idea of a time in which animals and humans could communicate quite freely, and that animals, that they are people, and that at the time humans recognized them as people and could see that very clearly. But also the idea that even to this day, animals are like people. They can sense when they're being respected, and also that when they die, their spirits go back to a spirit world, sometimes regarded as the domain of Jelen, the mother of all things over and over, and that if they've been properly respected, they reincarnate. Again, that theme that we talked about earlier, and they come back, that animals are choosing, or perhaps Jelen is choosing, to send them back based on the respect that they're shown. That respect can take a number of different forms, one of which is, as I said before, proper disposal of the bones of the dead. Now, if you don't believe in this spiritual tradition, you might not see that as having a direct conservation impact. However, I would argue that perhaps we should take a moment to consider our own cultural biases and sort of the way in which we sometimes immediately write off these things, and consider whether that would have consider what sort of worldview we're adopting when we judge that as having no impact. I'm not saying you should have to believe these things by any stretch of the imagination, just to suggest that we're all sort of bringing a worldview into the equation when we judge what counts as conservation, what doesn't. It's a complex question that oftentimes says a lot about what our particular views of nature are and what does or doesn't work to save nature. But furthermore, there were also other kinds of beliefs and practices that more directly relate to what sort of dominant U.S. society might think of as conservation behaviors. A good example is there's a story where, in this book, where a man is killing mice needlessly. They're just coming into his camp, near his campsite, and he keeps throwing them out and killing them in the process. And then he has a terrible dream of Jalen, who appears at first beautiful, but then kind of horrific to him, and it teaches him, like, I should not have been disrespecting animals. So there's this very much ethos of not just respecting by properly treating bodies, although that's a huge part of it, but also respecting by not killing needlessly in the case of these mice, right? Yes, it's one thing to kill a pest, it's another thing, though, to sort of kill almost for entertainment's sake, or just because you find them slightly annoying, right? Which this person was doing in this story. And so I think we have some good evidence then, despite the many things we don't know about pre-Christian religious practices in this area, because of information that's been lost. I think we do have some very good examples of where people's religious beliefs directly informed a sort of ethos of how you were to act towards the animals that you hunted or killed. And again, we could think of a lot of, and I could talk about a lot of other examples too of where religion having clear impacts on people's environmental behaviors. The last 10 years has seen a number of different efforts to preserve sacred sites, such as Mauna Kea that we've mentioned, or Bears Ears National Monument, or San Francisco Peaks, Bears Lodge up in Wyoming, which have been often profoundly influenced by people's spiritual views of these spaces. And then we could also think of, again, various kinds of taboos or restrictions people have had as a result of religion that have had different kinds of environmental impacts. I've mentioned several of these already. I'll mention one more. In pre-colonialism in the Hawaiian monarchy, the chief over an island, and especially the monarch over the islands, plural, could declare certain areas as tapu, as restricted, and as the certain areas of where you don't fish there. And as a result, whether or not this was how people were specifically thinking of it, they probably were, but one of the effects of it is that then creates sort of de facto fishing reserves, no fishing zones, where the fish population can regenerate. We can also think about things like in the Appalachian minings, you have you have an evangelical Christian anti-mining movement, at least you did a couple of decades ago when I learned about this, who bases its activism on sort of views of the Garden of Eden and not dominion over the land, but instead a caretaking relationship with the land, rooting that in the Genesis story. John Ware, who is significant for a number of reasons, we'll talk about him a lot more next week, but in profoundly shaping the national park system in the United States, who's both very fascinating and also very problematic in certain ways. But John Ware was clearly influenced by spiritual thoughts, not so much a specific world religion, so much as a more general spiritual tendency towards transcendentalism, towards the idea of nature as a spiritual preserve for people, particularly city people, to come and be recharged. He thought of it as sort of a temple. And so that clearly influenced his views and led to our national park system in some pretty direct ways. So, with all of that, I think we can see lots and lots of example where religious and spiritual beliefs do definitely affect people's environmental behaviors, sometimes in unexpected odd ways, oftentimes in pretty direct ways. Particularly certain animals or certain places are given an aura of sacredness, and therefore, or have an aura of sacredness, and therefore this leads to the conservation of them, as well as more generally ethical precepts about not overusing or perhaps not killing at all. So, religion and spirituality can matter a great deal. Environmental knowledge systems can matter a great deal. Of course, again, people's worldviews don't just come from their religion. And many people don't have a specific religious or spiritual tradition or aren't religious at all. And so to root all of this, to root all of environmental behavior in religion or spirituality would just be asinine stupidity, especially given the large number of people who are not religious or only very mildly so, but certainly does have an effect on some cultures more than others. And so it's something we need to think through as a very serious thing. And I think it's something that if we're serious about making a dent in environmental issues, one of the things we can think about is, are there ways in which, so one of the things that environmental anthropology has shown us again and again is that environmental programs tend to be more successful if they're grassroots, ground level, if you listen to locals, and if you can get local power players and influential people involved in conservation and have them actually be the ones that are crafting it or shaping it or voicing it, that can be much more powerful. And so I think if we're thinking of it in those terms, religion and spirituality for some communities has to be a part of that puzzle. And so speaking to local spiritual leaders and talking about what traditions already exist within the tradition in relation to the environment, and for those to be sort of built on as part of this, right? Not thinking that just because a group of people are using a different terminology to refer to environmental issues that they're not concerned about these environmental issues, but to see how people already are concerned about them, oftentimes through a spiritual rubric. These slides are not terribly necessary, other than I'm just bringing up the fact that even within the same religion, people can oftentimes have very different political views, and so we can't necessarily assume that because a religion has, quote, sacred ecology views, that we can necessarily predict people's behaviors. But in any case, I hope that this has been an interesting lecture. I hope it's given you a lot to chew on for your own work in helping save the world, and thinking through what degree, if any, sort of spiritual cosmologies and people's spiritual beliefs do or don't shape their behavior and views of the environment. So thank you so much for your time.